Hi, my name is Moth, and I have always wanted to make a video game. But making a video game is a lot of work, like years worth of work, and for the longest time I had no idea what kind of game I'd even be willing to commit that kind of time to. But in 2017 I finally had an idea for a game, and as of this year I am happy to announce that I have officially started development on Blood Crisis is going to be a throwback to the PS2 era hack-and-slash golden age, a love letter to the sincere, unironic edge of the early 2000s. Games like Shadow the Hedgehog, Devil May Cry, whatever the fuck this was, and most importantly, Kingdom Hearts. I spent most of my childhood doing two things: making animations using whatever I could get my little hands on, and playing Kingdom Hearts. I had always heard that the final mix versions of these games had a bunch of new stuff, but for a long time they were only available in Japan. So in 2017, when I moved out of my little hometown to study animation at university, I decided to pick up a copy of the PS4 collection as a little gift to myself. It was during my first playthrough of 2FM that I really started paying attention to all of the systems at play in this game, learning how they interacted with each other, and gained a deeper understanding of the combat in a way that I couldn't appreciate playing the original as a kid. Kingdom Hearts 2 at its peak is this blindingly fast, insanely elegant dance of blades, and the more times I play it, the more I crave other games like it. I mean, clearly I'm not the only one. Just look at some of the absolutely insane mods for this game and you'll see what I mean. There are so many cool, original ideas at play here that future titles in the series and other games of the genre never took the opportunity to expand upon. So, with an extremely expensive piece of paper, 20 years of hindsight, and a dream, I'm going to try and make a game that takes all of my favorite aspects of this genre and combines them into one, using Kingdom Hearts 2 as a foundation. Now, I know this is kind of a cliche with a lot of these YouTube devlog series, like combining all my favorite games into one or whatever, but I promise I do still have a concept of scope here. Now, there's nothing wrong with making an open-world RPG with base building and a crafting system and procedurally generated dungeons and loot and weapons and a day and night cycle and a morality mechanic and a companion system and a stupid kid. But I'm not doing all that. I'm perfectly happy with my game looking like an old obscure PS2 title. That's kind of the point. So I'm doing a 2004 style, a short single-player campaign with fast combat and fun movement. For once in my entire life, childhood nostalgia is actually benefiting me. Before I get into the actual dev stuff, I want to take a minute to talk game design, specifically Kingdom Hearts 2. Now, I have spent at this point literally hundreds of hours playing this game, and of those hundreds of hours, recently many have been spent basically doing stuff like this.
Yeah. Ha. Yeah. Ha.
To figure out not only what works, but how it works. In case you've never played 2FM, here's a quick breakdown to get you up to speed. Sora starts out with a very basic 3-hit combo. 2 normal hits, then a finisher. Sora can do this on the ground or in the air. This is pretty standard for an action RPG, but the one thing that I haven't really seen in another game is Kingdom Hearts 2's proximity-based combo system. Basically, targeting an enemy far away does a gap closer, targeting an enemy in the air does a leaping attack, you get the idea. And what's great about this system is that all of these attacks are tied to the X button, while still being consistent and intuitive to use. The game even teaches you this super early on. Sora's and Roxas's base 3-hit combos both follow this same philosophy, and they're each actually comprised of like 10 different potential attacks. Another, much more subtle lesson the game teaches you early on is how hitboxes interact with one another, and I genuinely think this is one of the most underappreciated and overlooked parts of Kingdom Hearts 2's combat. See, attacks in Kingdom Hearts 2 have kind of a hidden value of sorts that determines their power. If 2 attacks of the same power collide, like a basic combo starter, both characters parry each other and the player can quickly counterattack. If a player's weak attack collides with a strong attack, they're given iframes and put into a successful guard state, as if they had blocked the attack. But if the player parries a strong attack with another strong attack, they're given iframes and they continue uninterrupted. This system and proximity-based attacks work together to really embrace the player's instinct to mash X, and makes attacking feel really fast, fluid, and intuitive. You can use this to your advantage in basically every fight in the game, offering you safety and extra utility while encouraging you to explore the nuance of how your attacks interact with your enemies. And what's really genius about this is that at a higher level of play, it lets people do insane shit like this. This interaction of systems is the glue that holds everything in this game together. And that's just normal combos. You can also use square attacks to mix things up further, and you can even seamlessly weave magic into your combos, replacing any melee hit with a spell instead. The shortcut menu makes this super easy and lets you keep all of your spells and items only one additional button press away. This is a huge step up from the first game, where magic and combos were completely separate from one another. But I want to take this even further. See, in Kingdom Hearts 2, you can use a spell at any point in your combo, but doing so in the air will always end it. You can combo magic in the air in a few drive forms, sure, but as base Sora, you just can't, for some reason. And your movement abilities get shafted even harder, like air dodge especially. Air dodge is one of the coolest moves ever. It's sort of like a double jump, but it gives you more horizontal speed rather than vertical, and it lets you use the full distance and momentum even if you air dodge in the opposite direction that you were moving. And just because the developers of Kingdom Hearts 2 decided to go hard as fuck, not only does this move have iframes, it also has parry frames, meaning that you can use it to deflect projectiles or counter enemy attacks. But you just can't use this move if you attack in the air, like, at all. This means that your movement options in the air are severely limited if you decide to commit to an attack, and this sucks because air combos in this game feel really good to use, and Master Form is proof that comboing magic in the air can be extremely fun, interesting, and satisfying. So I want to tap into some of that potential, not only by letting players combo magic in the air, but by also making the aerial versions of spells function differently from their grounded counterparts. For example, and this is obviously subject to change, say fire creates a small shotgun-like blast in front of the player. Fire in the air could create a blast behind the player, launching them forwards. Maybe normal thunder does an AoE field on the ground, but in the air shoots a bolt straight down that bounces the player upwards a bit, giving them a little extra hang time during combos. You get the idea. I think this would give players a lot more freedom in how they want to approach each combat encounter without increasing the number of button presses or inputs required. But I'm not stopping there. I want to make magic finishers work differently from their regular counterparts as well. In Kingdom Hearts 2, magic finishers are slightly stronger than their base spells, but functionally they work the same. So in Blood Crisis, a grounded fire finisher could potentially create a burst of flames around the player and launch them into the air, and an aerial fire finisher would have them then crash back down to the ground and knock enemies up. Now obviously this kind of fucktuples my workload, so to even things out a bit, I'm going to be incorporating fewer spells overall. Magnet and Reflect are really cool, don't get me wrong, but they already come with a whole load of balancing issues on their own, so trying to create and balance 4 meaningfully unique variations of each is just not something I'm interested in doing. Speaking of cutting back my workload, I'm happy to announce that I'm also totally tossing party members out the window. As much as I love old Goof and Dongus, I feel like party members tend to be novel at best and genuinely detrimental at worst. So I'm just not gonna bother. It just seems like a lot of work for a mechanic that I'm not terribly attached to in the first place. However, I do really like the idea of having another character fight alongside you, so to do this I'm going to be combining summons and limits. Mechanically, these will probably work the same as limits in Kingdom Hearts 2, but due to the lack of constant party members, they'll hopefully feel a little more special, like you're tagging in a friend. Another change I'm making is getting rid of the Items tab on the command menu and moving items exclusively to shortcut menus, of which there will be more than one. By now, attentive viewers may have noticed that our command menu has gone from 7 different options across 2 menus to 4 options on 1, and we now have 2 buttons that don't do anything. So each sword in Blood Crisis comes with its own unique ability, limit, and burst form, Blood Crisis's version of drives. They work kind of like Keyblade transformations in Kingdom Hearts 3, but they're tied to a meter like drive forms, so you can strategically choose when you want to use them. And additionally, each burst form has a second, separate, customizable shortcuts menu tied to L2. So, if you were to use a burst form and switch to another weapon, you'd exit your first form and its timer would freeze until you switch back, letting you continually rack up burst gauge and switch between weapons to take full advantage of multiple movesets at once. There are obviously a lot of things I haven't touched on here yet, but these are the biggest fundamental changes, and I'm really happy with the place that I've settled on. So, let's talk game development. This game is going to require a really solid mechanical structure before I can get started on making, well, the actual game part of the game. I'm going to need all of my systems to be well organized and modular. Making a game is a lot like building a house. If you don't have a sturdy foundation, every new addition is just going to add more and more stress until everything eventually crumbles and falls apart. Now, inevitably with game dev, things are always going to go fucky eventually. So it's important to at least try and proactively learn to avoid the things we can predict. Luckily for me, I have a pretty extensive history in animation and 3D art. I love creating complex shaders and materials, and I think I'm pretty good at it. I really love procedural workflows, which is basically when you make art through coding and logic rather than placing everything by hand. I even gave a few lectures in college teaching other students how to do this stuff. It was kind of my thing, so naturally, I'm not doing any of that shit. I said Blood Crisis was going to look like a PS2 game, and that's not just for nostalgia's sake. I am only one person. I am a tiny little bug. I am trying to keep my scope in check here. Honestly, I still think all of the old Kingdom Hearts games look great in their own right. Games with a really cohesive and well-realized art style are kinda timeless. Now, despite my experience with 3D, this is actually my first foray into lower fidelity graphics, so it was important for me to figure out what kind of restrictions I was going to impose on myself, and how I could use those restrictions to my advantage. What's my max poly count for a character? What's the lowest image resolution I can use before things start looking bad? And, oh god, how am I supposed to texture without my fancy shaders? See, normally stuff like gloss and dirt and gritty details are all handled by separate textures. When these textures are layered on top of each other and plugged into a shader, you get a material that uses physically based rendering, or a PBR material for short. Basically, it's a way of cheaply emulating how light works in real life, and since I can't use this workflow, this means that all of my texture info has to be on one single image. So in order to start figuring out how I was going to tackle this, I decided to make a test run character, one that I would make from scratch all the way to a game-ready rig in order to figure out the best way to do things. This is what I ended up making, and I really like how he turned out. For this first test, I decided to try hand painting all of the textures, and it was fucking miserable. Despite how pleased I am with the end result, this took way too much time, especially considering how many characters and assets I'm going to need to make for this game. So I decided to try again with one of the player characters. Oh yeah, in case I forgot to mention, Blood Crisis actually has two protagonists, a robot warrior named Alpha Knight and a rebellious freedom fighter named Vel. Being a throwback to the hack-and-slash edgelord era of the mid-2000s, I really wanted to make sure that their designs were as iconic and easily recognizable as I could. I finished Alpha Knight's model in a few days and was actually really happy with the result. I often find I have to continually iterate on a design before I get something that I like, but this was one of those rare instances where I feel like I kind of nailed it on the first try. Even that first guy wasn't an original design, it's actually a drawing I did all the way back in 2010 that I repurposed for this game. There are obviously still a handful of things I'd like to go and clean up on Alpha, but largely I think his design is extremely solid. I also figured out a very handy workflow for making textures that has sped up my production a ton. You know how I said I couldn't use fancy shaders or lighting or anything? Well, that's still true in-engine, but using a little bit of secondary software magic, we can fake a ton of detail procedurally, and then send all of that information to one single texture that can then be read in the engine. In 3D, we often use panoramic photos or HDRIs to simulate light. Think Google Street View, it's basically a big spherical image that allows us to simulate what a 3D object and its textures would look like in that environment. Take this guy, for example. If I turn down the roughness all the way, you can see he almost acts like a mirror. This is all simulated inside the texturing program, and it's the exact thing that I can't use in my game. Notice how if I switch to just the base color channel, he's still gray, because that's the only information we have on the color, and so that's what it would look like in Blood Crisis. However, we can take all of this information and bake it down to just one channel. Notice how this one still functions like a real mirror, but this one stays in place like it's painted. That's because this one is a texture instead of actually running any real lights or ray traces or whatever. This way, we get the benefits of using an environment map to generate detailed visuals quickly, but the final export is still only a single image. Using this workflow, I can then mask off certain parts of the texture and use a different environment map so that I can get the best angle and lighting for my character. This also means that if I wanted to change the color of something, I can just change one single layer, and it automatically applies to my whole model instead of having to repaint everything or wrestle with trying to use filters. This works super well, and I'm fairly confident I can use it for a majority of my assets. So with texturing on Alpha finished, I used an auto-rigging plugin called Rigify to generate a skeleton, I created a few super temporary animations, designed a rudimentary sword, and finally had a protagonist moving around an engine. I spent a few days tweaking the character movement and testing out different methods of giving my character some weight. After things felt good, I looked on the Unreal Marketplace for a lock-on targeting system and found one with pretty great reviews. It was super easy to implement, but now I needed an enemy to lock on too. I sat down one morning and managed to model, texture, rig, and make a shader for this little guy all in one day. However, after getting him implemented in Engine, I realized that my character kind of bounces off of him, like he's made of stone. I figured there had to be some sort of weight value I could turn down, but nope. That's just not how Unreal works, I guess. This might not seem like a big deal on the surface, but it's actually super important to the foundations of this game. If enemies don't move out of the way when a player walks into them, it's basically a guarantee that they're going to get stuck on or trapped by an enemy, and as someone who's played a lot of action games, this always feels terrible. While I was lucky enough to have some friends try and help me figure out a way to implement this pushing system, every iteration was just janky as hell. Enemies would get stuck on each other, on walls, would clip through things, nothing worked right, it was just a complete fucking disaster. But then, I remembered a lesson I had just learned not long ago. So I checked and I found something that actually did exactly what I needed. For the next few months, I decided to work on my second protagonist, Vel, and this took up a considerably larger chunk of time. Alpha's rig only took a week, maybe, tops, but that's because Alpha's a pretty rigid, static character, and because the rig I made was total garbage. Now, you wouldn't know that just by looking at it, right? By all accounts, everything checks out here. But if I were to say, stretch the hands, his pauldrons grow in size. And trying to pose the scarf is a pain in the ass. And if you bend the fingers, they turn wrong and look all fucked up, so you have to account for that by twisting them back into place. And he's missing a holding bone in his left hand, meaning he can't dual wield. And worse than that, his sword is hard-coded into part of his model, meaning it's always stuck to him and he can't switch weapons. Oh, and also the entire rig is completely fucked and could fall apart at basically any second because I exported it improperly. See, this is one of those things with game development that I think people get, but don't really understand the severity of. Just because something looks good on the surface doesn't really mean it's representative of something polished or even functional, really. So, using what I learned from Alpha, I sought to make Vel's rig as airtight as I possibly could, and I made sure that I did not give up until things worked properly. Unlike Alpha, Vel's rig is actually fairly sophisticated, and it has a lot of cool features that I'm very proud of. For one, the hair and collar have a procedural wind feature that allows me to turn up the speed and direction of the wind on each part individually. This is very intuitive, and I have full control over all of it using only these 3 sliders. Additionally, Vel has proper bones for each hand with switchable parents, meaning that I can detach the weapons from the hands in the event that I want Vel to throw their swords or something like that. The thing that really took up the biggest chunk of time with this rig, however, was the skirt. This fucking skirt. I was stuck on this specific part of the rig for so long. Fabric can already be really tricky to rig, but this skirt was especially bad just because of how fucking weird the shape is, and I was not budging on the shape. After some heartache and struggle though, I finally got something that gave me a lot of room to do some pretty crazy stuff and really exaggerate the size and silhouette of this thing. But then I tried to actually animate it, and well, it was a fucking nightmare. Like I said, it worked great for posing, but the thing with creating rigs is that you want to give your animator the most possible control with the fewest possible bones to pose, and this one had a lot. It's totally fine to have a bunch of micro detail layers for fine-tuning your rig, but those should be used for fixing small details and polish, not a required part of every single key pose. So I went back to the drawing board again. This time, I really tried to give myself as much control as possible with as little effort, and this is what I came up with. It's still not perfect by any means, but it functions extremely well and is super easy to use. Now, remember how I said Alpha's exported rig was fucked? The reason is I exported the entire control rig, meaning there was a ton of bones in this hierarchy that don't actually do anything in engine and only clutter and slow down the game. Basically, when you make a rig, some bones deform the mesh directly, while others just hold code that tell adjacent bones what to do in your animation software. When exporting to a game engine, it's important to only keep these deformed bones, so the proper workflow is to create an entire separate skeleton consisting of only these essential bones needed by the game engine. Then, this skeleton is constrained to your control rig, that more complex skeleton that we use for animating. This way, any changes made to the control rig won't break or alter the deform rig in any way. I made sure to do this with Vel, exported, and everything seemed to work okay, surprisingly. I once again created a bunch of very quick placeholder animations, pulled everything into Engine, and finally got back to coding. My first goal was to properly implement weapons. In order to handle all of the different item and weapon information, I decided to use something called data assets. Basically, a data asset is a big empty container that you can shove a bunch of variables into, and then reference at runtime. I create a generic base data asset with an empty variable slot so that I can create child classes of it for each sword and give each one its own model and stats. All I have to do is plug the model in and... oh. Huh. I had to tinker with this for almost an hour before figuring out the issue. I'm not sure why, but if you want to attach one component to another, it seems you have to use a skeletal mesh or the collisions go absolutely bonkers. So I add a skeleton to my sword, re-imported it, and voila, it works. This was actually a good thing for me to learn because it directly ties into one of the most crucial parts of this game's development: hitboxes. See, I only had one bone in the mesh originally to just fix that collision issue, but I quickly realized that my swords would in fact need at least 2 bones each. I then create 2 flags in my attack animation. When the first flag is reached in the animation, it sends a signal to my animation blueprint, which then hands it off to my weapon. The weapon then finds the location of each of these 2 bones in the exact moment the signal fires, divides between the 2 of them to create 3 additional points of reference in between, and adds all of these locations to a cache. The next frame, the same thing happens, but the weapon traces a line between the current position and the cached position. Then, this process repeats for every frame until the animation either reaches the ending flag or is interrupted. If you're wondering why the bones are so off-center, that's actually intentional. One thing you may not know about Kingdom Hearts 2, even if you've played it dozens or even hundreds of times, is how absolutely bonkers disjointed Sora's hitboxes are. Like, seriously, look at this. If this was a fighting game, this dude would be banned at every tournament. It's like Jigglypuff, but every move is back air. But it does make sense in a game like this, and it's a huge part of why Sora feels so fast. It's because he's literally hitting enemies before he even touches them. It just happens so fast that you don't even notice it. But it's absolutely critical to the responsiveness of the game, so I made sure to do the same. With my hitboxes now functioning, it's time to implement the weapon switching system. In my player blueprint, I create 3 empty data asset variables, 1 for each weapon slot, and then an additional 4th to be our current weapon. Whenever the game starts or the player switches weapons, our current weapon variable looks at our navigation index and sets the current weapon to whatever is equipped in that slot. Cool. The next thing I worked on was weapon transformations. A huge part of my design philosophy with this game is approaching most of my problems with the mentality of, would 12-year-old me have thought this was sick as fuck? And if not, I keep making it more ridiculous until the answer is yes. All this to say, the first 2 weapon transformations are a huge-ass gun with 9 revolving barrels and a rocket-powered scythe. I know game designers who use subtlety, and they're all cowards. So for burst transformations, I create a separate animation set for each form, and simply added a function during my weapon set switch event to check if the weapon is currently transformed, and apply the respective animation/texture set if that's the case. I had a bunch of trouble with this at first, but after many hours of struggle, I finally got it working how I wanted to, and I think this is going to be a good jumping off point for working on some of the more complex and intricate parts of this game's combat. And that's pretty much it for now. There's a ton of smaller things I've done that I sadly just don't have time to talk about in this video because I don't want it to be 10 hours long. But if you're interested in keeping up with development or want to help support the project, please consider checking out my Patreon. Blood Crisis is, at the moment, a one-person project, and I work full-time as a freelancer, so the more support I get for the game, the more time I can spend working on it. If we can manage to hit 15 patrons by the end of the month, I'll also start doing weekly development streams where I talk art, game design, and chat with you, the viewers. We're actually already halfway there thanks to my incredible first wave of patrons. Let it be known that these absolute legends were the first people on the Blood Crisis hype train. That's going to be it for this video. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!